We're here today to speak with one of the contributors to our new book, How to Heal Our Divides. Todd Deatherage serves as Executive Director of Telos. Telos forms communities of American peacemakers along lines of difference, equipping them to reconcile conflict at home and abroad. Historically, their primary focus has been America's relationship to Israel-Palestine. In recent years, they've begun to replicate their model in other conflict and post-conflict areas. Todd spent 16 years in senior positions in the legislative and executive branches of the United States government before co-founding the Telos Group. From 2005 to 2009, he was Chief of Staff in the Secretary of State's Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department. He also spent 2 years as Senior Advisor in the Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, where he specialized in religious freedom in the Middle East. Todd worked for a decade in the U.S. Congress, including 6 years as Chief of Staff to Senator Tim Hutchinson. So Todd, it's so wonderful to have you and Telos participate in this project. Thank you so much.
We're so grateful. Thank you, Brian.
I kind of briefly touched on your background, but could you talk to that a little bit further?
Sure. I grew up in the American South, down in Arkansas, in a kind of just sort of conservative small town background. And when I went to college, I'd always been interested in politics. My parents had both been involved in local politics, and I got involved in some campaigns and that sort of thing. I was a high school teacher for a while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I got involved in a congressional campaign, and we won. And ultimately that brought me on the staff of a member of Congress who then became a U.S. Senator and brought me to Washington. And that was, more than 25 years ago. And I always say I came to Washington back in the 90s with a sincere Christian faith, but a really thin theology that had not quite prepared me for knowing how to deal with the complexity of the world I was in and issues of governance in a pluralistic society and power and justice and all those sorts of things. And so I ended up on this very sort of deeper theological journey as I'm trying to work on Capitol Hill and make sense of life, that brought me to some sort of different places in my understanding of even my own faith and how to live that out in the public square, which is ultimately the road that got me involved in the work of human rights and religious freedom, first on the Hill and then in the State Department, which is, again, ultimately led me to the Middle East and to Israel-Palestine and looking at issues there.
Wow, that had to be an amazing set of experiences that you had in all those different venues.
Quite a journey, yes.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for.
Good. So how did you take all of that and end up forming Telos?
Well, so I was working at the State Department and spending time in the Middle East and meeting with human rights activists and religious freedom advocates in different countries around the Middle East. And more people who were engaged in that work in the region were encouraging me to look more closely at the conflict in Israel and between Israelis and Palestinians. And ultimately, I started to try to meet people, Israelis, Palestinians, experts in that particular conflict in that part of the world, and began to travel there. And it was on my very first trip there where I met with a variety of people, again, from both sides of the conflict, and really hearing their stories and seeing the impact the conflict had on their lives, and then seeing the American role in it all, that I came back convicted of something, even though I wasn't sure exactly what it was at the time. But I was sure that the American interests were all on the side of peacemaking, and that we had a lot of influence in that conflict, and that we ought to marshal our resources and influence in ways that made it easier for the parties to solve their conflict. And also that one of the things that challenged our interventions there as Americans in helpful ways was that this was sort of a vexing foreign policy challenge that functioned like a domestic political issue. And a lot of Americans really cared about it, but they cared about it in ways that were very much just a mirror of the conflict. We kind of imported the conflict into our own culture, into our own politics, into our own churches. And so we are pro-Israel, often in ways that are anti-Palestinian, or some are pro-Palestine in ways that are anti-Israeli. And all that can feel really good and right. And yet in the end, if you're just serving conflict, you're not really helping anybody. And so I was on this journey, initially just to figure out what are the right things that we could do as Americans to better allow for the people there to live a different kind of life in which everyone could flourish, in which they move beyond the conflict that they've been in for many decades. But I also had this deepening conviction as a Christian who was serious about my faith, about the role Christianity was playing there, like from the outside. There's an indigenous Christian presence there, but I'm talking about Christians from America and elsewhere who care about the conflict, but often intervene in ways that make it harder to solve. And so really trying to take seriously the teachings of Jesus and my own faith tradition about what it would look like to come alongside people in this difficult situation of again, sort of decades of conflict with a real power asymmetry built into it, and real issues of justice and insecurity and all that. And what would it look like to take Jesus seriously when he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and when he talked about loving enemies? And there's so much that that Jesus taught us about how to live in the world, and he taught it from that very place. And so, what would it look like to take that seriously now? And so that led me ultimately to want to work particularly with Americans of all faiths or none, but particularly with Christians, to help Christians find a different way to care about the place, to care about the people in ways that were much more connected to the kingdom of God and to the moral universe, in ways that would say there's no good future for one group of people in this land without a good future for the other. It can't be a zero-sum game. It's a very small piece of real estate. There are many Jews and Arabs that live there together, and they have to find some way to work it out together. It can't be just one side ruling over the other, or one side living there without the other around, as much as some might like that. And if there's going to be a future for one, there has to be a future for both, and it works in both directions. And so helping Christians step into that space in particular has been a passion of mine, but helping just lots of Americans find ways to engage that differently has been kind of my life's work for the last, more than 12 years now.
So how did Telos actually start? What kind of logistics, to make that company happen, and what were kind of your initial programs?
Yeah, well, so I mean, again, my whole background, as I said, I was an educator for a few years, a high school teacher, but I was spent most of my career in politics and public policy and in government. I wasn't, and still don't think of myself as an entrepreneur who goes off and starts a nonprofit. That's not necessarily anything that I ever had in my line of sight.
But you did it.
I had it. Well, I did it together. I didn't do it by myself as part of the key to that. I had a deep conviction and a deep sense of implication as an American and as a Christian in what was going on there that I couldn't walk away from, and I didn't know what to do with it. But one of the folks that I'd met among many in this journey was an American guy from a Palestinian background, a guy named Greg Khalil, who was raised in San Diego, California. His family's from there. His parents were professors in Southern California. And Greg was sort of the opposite of me in every way. He was from a Greek Orthodox background, but his parents were professors, and he'd gone to Yale Law School, and it was the opposite of my sort of family story altogether. He was progressive politically. I mean, all the things that I wasn't in some ways. But Greg is one of the first people I met when I started to engage this issue. He had been working as an advisor to Palestinian negotiators on the peace talks, and he'd been briefing folks like me about what the requirements would be, or what it would look like to advance the peace negotiations and conflict resolution on the ground. And Greg had moved back to the U.S. after spending some time there as an international lawyer, and he had this idea to engage people in this work. And he invited me, to brief me on what he wanted to do and to kind of get my feedback. But basically, we agreed to join forces. He invited me in on the project he'd been dreaming about and working on, and we launched Telos together just as I was leaving the Bush administration. My last job in government, I was a political appointee in the administration of President George W. Bush, and I was leaving the State Department as the administration ended. And so the week that happened is the week we formally launched Telos, and we began. And our work was in the beginning was focused entirely on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and our mission statement was specific to that. Our work has always been about engaging a variety of communities, but we've about 2/3 of our work has kind of always been with American Christians because they care a lot about it. But again, often in ways that make the conflict harder to solve. And so helping Christians redirect their interests and passions and concerns about the people and places there in ways that allow everyone in the land to flourish. And so from the very beginning, we've created our tagline for that work in Israel-Palestine, which is pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace, because we don't believe you can be for one at the expense of the other. We think, again, if there's a moral universe, we have to live in some way, in a way that's consistent with it. And that is to sort of remember that I can't have for myself and my family, my tribe, what I won't allow for my neighbor, even if my neighbor is my enemy. Because again, in Christian understanding, Jesus taught us that we are to not just love those who are like us and just love, our friendly neighbors, but we're actually, the heart of Christianity is this notion of enemy love. And so this idea of loving enemies is really central to what it means to live out Christian faith in the world. And so in calling people into this realization, understanding that if that's true and in a universal way, then it has to work itself out in places like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So from the beginning, we've had this notion that we advocate for security, dignity, and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike, for mutual flourishing, the flourishing of all in the land. And whatever the arrangement that looks like in terms of the political solution and so forth, that's to be determined and be decided. But that's the baseline that you have to kind of operate from if you want to move to a better place for all the people who live there. And so our primary program from the very beginning was to take people on a unique journey there, where we literally entered into their lives and stories and met people on both sides, multiple perspectives on both sides, because there's not just one Israeli narrative and history and one Palestinian one. There's a lot of different experiences of their histories. And so entering into those stories and then along the way, meeting with a few of those folks who are doing the honest work of conflict resolution, coexistence, reconciliation, justice, and peacemaking, and learning from them about what it looks like to actually, in the middle of a conflict situation, be one of those folks that's trying to be disruptive and trying to do things that would allow them to break free from it.
Very cool. I mean, that had to be a ton of really impactful experiences for people to go on.
They have been. It's changed so that these trips that we've been doing now have changed so many people's lives. Literally, people have changed their occupations. It's changed the direction of what they do. But it's particularly more importantly and prevalently, it's just changed the way they both interact with others and the way they see the world. I've had so many people come back and say, you didn't just give me kind of a new way to see that reality there and the situation there, but you gave me a whole new set of glasses to see the world, which is what ultimately led us to broaden our mission statement, because people came back and they say, okay, now I care about that differently. I want to advocate for both people and both sides. And I want to use whatever influence I have in ways that encourage and foster, the work of peace and conflict resolution there. But I also want to figure out, how do I deal with some of these vexing challenges right here in my own community? And so some people began to look at the work of like interfaith relations, so you had Christian pastors coming back and there's a mosque and a synagogue, just in the same community, and they don't know anybody there. They don't have any connections there. And so starting to work on those things. Other people went into, other areas. But one of the primary places that people began to look at was the issue of race in America. And, why do we still have so much conflict around race and racial justice in America after all these years, and trying to understand those issues better and trying to find some way to apply what we were learning in Israel-Palestine, what people were learning from that conflict into our own situation here at home, which has led us to create some new programming, including a trip experience in the American South that seeks to tell a sort of a more complete and version of our own American story that connects to the way that we have in the beginning always had to sort of had this thing in tension between the aspirations of America and the ideals of America that were even expressed in our founding documents, and the lived reality of what that actually looked like, and the distance between the two, and the legacies of that over time. And so that's been a lot of our more recent work, is to help us kind of understand our own American story better and how we might play a different kind of role in dealing with historic injustices that continue to manifest themselves in American life today. That's just excellent. I love that.
And along the way, you guys developed a set of principles and practices for peacemaking. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we were just coming out, or hopefully we're moving toward the other side of this pandemic that the world's been living under for a year now. And one of the things that we've done over the last year is really take the time to distill the things that we've learned from the people doing amazing work. Because not only are we working in Israel, Palestine, and now in the American South, we've also been taking a few trips to South Africa, and we are working on doing some work in Northern Ireland and Ireland and looking at the issues of that conflict, especially post Good Friday Agreement. And what we've learned from these people has been just amazing stuff that it certainly influenced how each of us in the Telos community think about the world and try to live it out every day. But we tried to distill all of those learnings into something that was going to be usable for all of our folks, and that would also inform the way that we talk about and teach what we do. And so we created the 6 principles and 6 practices of peacemaking that we think are just kind of essential to help, the principles that you can use to build your peacemaking, a peacemaking foundation, and then sort of practical things you can do, 6 things you can do to live this out every day. And I would say that when we started this work back in 2009, we didn't actually use the words peace and peacemaking at the time in any of our communications. We knew that's kind of the work we were doing, but we also knew that those are words that are often seen in very unserious ways. And, we're like a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, and you don't want to be unserious in Washington, right? This is a place of serious people with serious ideas, but really we also knew that just those words kind of that are in our normal usage are not often seen as serious things. And yet what we knew, and what we discovered even more than we knew, is how serious they really are, and how gritty and difficult real peacemaking is. How actually violence is actually sometimes a much easier response. If you have ability to use violence or use force or coercion, that can be an easier response than doing the more difficult work of nonviolence and peacemaking. And so we over time became much more comfortable in actually using the language, because we felt like we were almost helping to reclaim this in terms of what it really means, what peacemaking really is, and how gritty and difficult it is, and yet how transformative it is when people actually live it out. And so we, again, over the last year, created this Principles and Practices of Peacemaking document as another step in that way to kind of say, this is what it actually is. This is what we really mean. And if you want to kind of sum it up, one of the ways that peacemaking is often seen as an unserious endeavor is when we use it to sort of just argue for calm and quiet and everybody kind of behaving nicely and pretending like we don't have differences. We see peacemaking as actually the way to deal with our differences. It's not pretending we don't have differences. It's actually the way we tackle the deep things that divide us, the real things that are really consequential, that separate us and divide us. And so Martin Luther King, very famously said that peace is not the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. So one of the principles of peacemaking is how deeply intertwined peace and justice are. And whatever you're doing, you have to do it. It has to be built on a foundation of the pursuit of justice. But you also have to remember that the pursuit of justice has to be tempered in some way, or it can just turn into revenge itself. And so there's all these things you learn in peacemaking that are really important about how we create a different reality that's a better one than we're living in, and even maybe feeling trapped in right now, that is oriented toward a different reality that's more bent toward reconciliation and healing. And because you can engage even in the work of justice in ways that actually don't take you to a place of reconciliation and healing. And so this is the way we deal with both historic and present injustices, with this orientation toward reconciliation and healing that I think is so needed right now, especially in our own country.
Wow. Well, it's clear you are taking this serious, and understanding all the nuances of how to accomplish things in an incredibly complex and difficult environment. So that's really it's really great to see that you guys have been able to do this. It's impressive. So kind of as we come out of the pandemic, what kind of programs are you guys putting in place going forward?
Yeah, so we are hoping to resume travel by the fall, both to Israel, Palestine, to the American South, and to, again, other places like South Africa, and eventually by next year, hopefully to Northern Ireland and Ireland. So those are opportunities that people have. We're not a travel program, and you don't just sort of sign up for an individual trip. We take people in community with each other. That's very much been a part of our model from the beginning, that we believe that it's the in our current mission statement, which you read in the beginning, we form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference. That's very central to what we do. So we invite people to go on this journey as a community of people, so that when it's over, they can stay on the journey, because these trips are just meant to be an on-ramp to open you up to a new set of experiences that will give you an opportunity to do something with it on the other end. And if you do that in isolation, it's a very different road than if you do it as a community of people. So we invite communities of people to come together. So if there's a community of people who want to have an experience with us, we would welcome you to reach out and work with us to create some kind of trip experience for you. We also have a newsletter. You can go to our website, telosgroup.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter. It comes out twice a month, and it gives you both some analysis of issues around the conflict in the Middle East and also in other places that we're working, but also just gives you some basic information about peacemaking. There's always something about the principles and practices of peacemaking in there, and something that's hopefully applicable and interesting about those things. So it's a great resource if people are interested in signing up for that. We also have launched a program in the last couple of years called the Telos Table. It's mostly for folks who've been on our trips, and it's a way for them to stay together, but it's actually applicable for groups of people who even haven't been on the trips, where you can commit to a dinner opportunity, again, in a world where that's possible post-pandemic, a shared meal around a table, like every 3 months or so, and with a facilitated conversation. And we train volunteer table hosts to lead these conversations from your community. And then, so we give you some ideas about topics and materials and that sort of thing. And people through an evening go through a difficult issue around which people will have some legitimate and honest disagreement. And you still try to find ways to come together around some common action that you can take. Because we do think that learning in itself is important, but the kinds of experiences that we're exposing people to are meant to lead us toward doing something about them, toward action. And especially, pardon?
What a concept.
Well, exactly. Especially when we're taking people into the lives of vulnerable populations, whether it's in the Middle East or in the American South or wherever, and you're so not to just be extractive of their experiences so that we can have our own kind of personal transformation, but that our personal transformation would actually be a part of a greater societal transformation that would also feed back and help improve their lives, or it would allow us to even follow the leadership of folks in these places to become active. As again, one of the things we learn in peacemaking is the importance of centering the leadership of the marginalized. And so literally, allowing ourselves to be led by folks in these vulnerable communities and following their action and using our voices to be advocates and activists for things that make not just their lives better, but that allow for greater human flourishing for all of us.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what the focus of How to Heal Our Divides is intended to be. It's actually doing something about it. Not just talking about it, not just learning about it, but actually doing something about it. So, you guys are a role model for that, which is really wonderful.
Well, we think that's a really important concept. I mean, from my own, again, Christian background, one of the folks I've most learned from about this is the writer, the Catholic theologian Henry Nouwen. And Nouwen has this way of explaining it that it's been so beautiful, and it's also been so explanatory of why some of our stuff works so well, because he talks about the obligation that he's writing to a Christian audience. So the obligation that he says Christians have to enter into the messiness of the world, to all these sort of difficult and broken places where vulnerable people exist, and being there with those folks and allowing ourselves to be transformed personally, allowing our own hearts to be transformed by the experiences, but then when we do that, we open up the possibility then that we can be a part of the societal transformation in ways that we would never have imagined possible. And so much of our work is built on that idea that change and transformation are possible, because it's so easy when there's so many things going wrong in the world as there are right now, to become, cynical and convinced that nothing can ever change, and to build everything you do just around that. And we believe that the first principle of peacemaking is that change is possible. Transformative change can happen. It doesn't often do that. I get that. And I understand that. I've been to all the hard places, and I understand what that looks like. If you're pegging yourself on some kind of scale between optimism and pessimism, the pessimists tend to have most of the facts, and I understand why you would do that. But we think there's a whole other sort of scale to plot ourselves on, and it's sort of the one between hope and despair. And we have chosen to live in hope. We learned from a Palestinian Christian theologian from Bethlehem. His own understanding of hope has been so instrumental to me. His name is Mitri Rahab, and Mitri says that hope is not the same thing as optimism. It's not an emotion. It's not a feeling. Hope is what you do. And so basically you live and act in hopeful ways in the order to open up the possibility for a different reality, right? And you're all the time, you're refusing to allow yourself to fall into despair. So you're living and acting out hope. And in doing that, you open up the possibility that change can happen.
Wow, that's so cool. I mean, how can we not live in hope? I mean, the alternative is just do nothing, and just try to make things worse. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense just from a purely logical perspective, right? I mean, I totally believe that we've all got an obligation to try to make things better.
That's right.
And, the paths that you guys are forging, are an effective way to do that. So anyway, what types of communities do you most often partner with for these experiences? I imagine there's a variety.
So we work with a lot of churches around the country. So we're not everywhere, but we're in a number of geographic locations, and we work with churches, but we're always open to new communities. Our ideal work is not just one partner in a particular geographic area, but more than one, so that even one community can also be connected to another, and those communities become something larger. Because the sort of Telos network is a variety of communities from around the country who may act, individually in their own community in certain ways, but the power and strength of the movement is that they're also connected to people around the country. And in many cases, they're people who are very different from them. So again, our primary work has been with Christians and with Christian leaders and with churches, but we also have done a lot of work with business leaders and entrepreneurs, with philanthropists and academics, and musicians and artists and storytellers. And that's been a big part of our work, is working with people engaged in culture creation and story, because rarely about a difficult issue like those that divide us in these very entrenched conflicts do we kind of get argued into a new way of thinking about it or see it. I mean, it's the human condition. We almost never change our mind because someone argued us into a new position based on a set of facts. But we do change our mind about things, and we do open ourselves up to seeing and living differently, but it's usually out of a set of experiences and relationships. And we feel like we don't necessarily just need a lot more information, although information is really important in these conflicts and these very seemingly intractable challenges. But better stories are really important too. Telling truer and better stories are really a big part of that. And so we've spent a lot of time with folks in those creative communities, helping to write better music and sing better songs and write novels and make films and things like that. That also are a way to reach a lot of folks at a different level.
Well, Todd, I really appreciate you spending some time with us. And even more than that, I appreciate all the work that you've done, to help improve our world and move it in the right direction. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks for this opportunity. I mean, we're so grateful to be a part of this larger network that you're highlighting and pulling together. And I mean, from the very beginning, we have known that our work is so important to us that we've devoted our lives to it, but it's not sufficient for all the things that need to be done. And we've been always so grateful when we have, come across others who are doing similar things in different ways around the country, and always wanting to highlight other, great organizations and great communities of folks doing good things. And we're really glad to be a part of this community and network. So thanks for pulling all this together.
Oh, well, certainly. I mean, we all hear all the bad news, every night on the evening news and 27 other ways. But, I think the world needs to hear about the hope, about the things that are really good and really positive, immediately making a difference. And so you guys are doing that, and that's what matters. And I really want to help spread the word about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, Todd, thanks so much.
You bet.